Good evening, folks. So, in this video, I'm going to be discussing the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill. The main thing I want to highlight with this is, first of all, why we need reform, how it links to pet theft reform, and why that is something that is going to be heavily, in my view, this sentencing reform bill is going to be needed to enable the framework for pet theft reform to come through and to be challenged in the House. And effectively, what the Animal Welfare Act, broadly speaking, covers, the points by MPs that have been made in debates which it won't cover, and making sure that these later amendments are picked up, or later suggestions are picked up in subsequent readings of different bills and different legislation, and are enshrined in a different piece of legislation at a later date, and that we continue to effectively campaign for this. Other elements that I'm going to be speaking about is really what we need the reform for, why it hasn't effectively, in its current state, been effective in terms of tackling animal abuse, the different areas of animal abuse crime is taking place in the country, why England and Wales are lagging behind Northern Ireland and Scotland in this respect, and why the bill will level the playing field and bring us up. So, to start us off, the sentencing bill, the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill, broadly speaking, is looking at bringing the maximum sentence up from its current levels to 5 years. The reason this is important is there has been points made by MPs, members of the public, Battersea, the Kennel Club, Dogs Trust, from various parts of the UK, and like I say, this is particularly focusing on England and Wales. The courts as well have, broadly speaking, found that the desire to effectively instill a further sentence has not been something that they have been able to do or have been able to put in place for the accused, because there hasn't been that facility where they have the scope to do that. They have at the moment punitive fines and a punitive sentence rather than a more justifiable or more, in my view, effective sentencing. Don't get me wrong, I would certainly prefer to see the sentencing of animal abuse increase from the figures in the sentencing bill from 5 years to potentially 10 years. But this is a vast step forward in terms of it's a multitude better than what it currently is. Now, in terms of other areas, why we need it. Currently, if someone abuses the animal, a lot of the comments from the general public tend to be, if someone has abused an animal, has been sentenced, the length of the sentence is no disincentive to really continue to commit that crime again, and it doesn't effectively act in any form of punishment. It doesn't give that voice to the voiceless in terms of being able to make our justice system effective. Now, people have rightly raised points that our animal welfare laws are some of the highest standards in the world. However, our sentencing has fallen a lot further short of other countries, even within the UK. Northern Ireland and Scotland are both already at this level, are already at a 5-year sentencing guide for a maximum sentence, whereas Wales and England are lagging behind. Now, in this particular area, the reason why we need to do more is effectively, in terms of how we classify animal abuse, we can identify different types of organised crime, whether that be dog fighting, puppy farming, animals that have been effectively stolen and then used for either dog baiting, dog fighting, dog baiting, or for illegally breeding unhealthy animals, which later go on to effectively make these organised gangs a great deal of money. Now, whilst we recognise that these are animal abuse and we are tightening welfare laws to effectively stop some of these abuses taking place and to empower the police force, what we aren't able to do is effectively keep them from doing it. The detriment for them to actually do this in society is not there. If they know they are going to get a small fine, or they are effectively going to get potentially a commuted sentence and a lifetime ban from keeping animals, all of these elements are not effective enough to stop organised gangs continuing to do this. And equally, what I would particularly like to see at one point is to be able to recognise different levels of abuse and potentially tie in pet theft as a separate bill, which has a separate sentence to itself, which can then be tied into the animal welfare abuse side of it. So where the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill reforms the Animal Welfare Act in the respect that the sentences can be compounded together, where these organised gangs are effectively given 1 5-year sentence for effectively abusing the animal, putting it through, whether that be mutilations which have been taking place to enable it to be put through in dogfighting, or whether it's sustained these mutilations from the dogfight itself. So whether the dogs that they've stolen have then been put through ear mutilation, so where their ears have been cut to potentially remove tattoos or tags, which is often done with rescued greyhounds. You see a lot of this when animals are abandoned, where their tattoos have been removed, or the part of the flesh where the tattoo has been put in place has been removed to make them harder to identify to the owners, making it very difficult for the RSPCA to track the owner down and to then allow the police to prosecute. Now, in my view, having these two sentences or two pieces of legislation, the sentencing bill that's currently going through and pet theft reform bill, if you have these together and had them both at with a maximum sentence of 5 years, 10 years is a deterrent. It's a deterrent enough time. Yes, it could go further, but it's at least a step in the right direction. It's enough to give the court system the opportunity to see whether it does have an effect on these types of crime levels, and whether it does actually start to see numbers of these abuses going down and numbers of pet thefts going down, and equally making the level of fine a significant amount higher, so that it does cripple the organisations and stop them being able to effectively just move the puppy farm to a different location or move their enterprise elsewhere. Something needs to be done so that it's in a position where we can effectively reform this. And in terms of elements that go on that are connected to this, which are relevant, points that were raised in the Animal Welfare Sentencing Bill's debate or reading in the House of Commons were points about distribution of video evidence that people have taken and shared via social media or via private messaging. Now, this is another important area that, in my view, as a teacher, needs to get ironed out for a broad spectrum of abuses. And as the chair did bring up in the debate, this has already got some scope under different bills, but it needs to be effectively tightened up more. We are aware that the area that definitely needs to be tightened up more specifically is not only those who are producing content, but those who are also sharing the content, and channels need to be more. There needs to be more channels in place to notify the police and notify local authorities of where this has been seen, so that again they can be tackled and the abusers can effectively be both. They can be the issue with the user can be addressed. People are aware of how they should notify or inform the police, what they should do in terms of conduct with that information online, and how to notify the correct channels and not put themselves at further risk, or to effectively unintentionally or intentionally promote this material and share it more widely. Now, in my particular field, which encompasses the Animal Welfare Act in a great detail, the other key areas that definitely need to see some reform, or would need to see some reform with this bill, is what we don't want to see long term is a differentiation between our wild and our domestic animals. What we don't want to be in a position of is where we have a two-tier welfare sentencing system, where abuse to companion or domestic animals is met with a harsher sentence than those that have abused wild animals or animals in the countryside in a variety of different ways, have seen some form of they are treated as a second tier animal or in a second class system. We don't want to set that basis up, and that needs to be tightened up sooner rather than later, because what we don't want to see happening is where people who can effectively abuse our native species or even our non-native species in a way that causes them unnecessary suffering and abuse, and it needs to be in a way where they're treated with the dignity they deserve. And that means even if the animal is arguably viewed as a pest by some people, that it's humanely either moved or euthanized by someone who's trained, not put through abuse, as we've seen in the news with people taking actions into their own hands and then getting only a small punishment and a slap on the wrist fine. It needs to be something that is a deterrent for people doing that, and so the only people who are trained to dispatch the animal are doing this, and it's not people who are taking effectively law into their own hands and causing abuse, which is going to potentially cause long-term suffering. And this is an area that we need to be aware of, does need reform, and the right is going to certainly be areas where, not only in the areas of pet theft, but in terms of abuse more generally speaking with wild animal crime, and where we've had other cases of where there still is where we still have poaching of livestock in our farming communities, or where we have cases where you have people who are hare coursing, snaring at different animals, or in cases where badger baiting is still taking place. And these are all areas where we need to recognise that the sentences need to fit the level of the crime and the level of suffering those animals have faced, and we need to action this quickly and action this sooner. And for anyone who would like to get in touch and wants to continue to champion the cause for the voiceless, please do get in touch, and I'm more than happy to provide further content in terms of what we can do more and how we can campaign for change.